This story begins not very optimistically, namely with the poisoning of a beautiful girl who was not guilty of anything. And in the last seconds of her life, she couldn't believe that she had worked so hard all this time just to die in the blink of an eye. In fact, in the world where she lives, every 200 years there is a so-called calamity. At the same time, a saint comes into the world who is able to seal it once and for all. Some say they're born into a family of Falantes from generation to generation. Saints are always bonded in marriage to royalty, and this happens even in the initial stages of life. That's what happened. And to the heroine of this story, when she was very young, a guy came to her to get acquainted. The boy was not much older than she was. He bowed and said he was the first prince of the kingdom of Hilaitos, and his name was Andrew Hilaitos. This little girl's name was Philomela Phalantes. This girl was a saint of that generation. From that moment on, boy and girl were never separated for a moment. They continued to grow up together and spent every free minute together. Andrew, since the girl was a little younger, helped her learn to read, her many other things. And so 11 years have passed since then. Philomela had grown up to be a healer for warriors who were injured. One day a man came to her. She dressed his wound and directed her hands to heal it. However, the girl did not succeed immediately. When behind her she heard people whispering, other warriors who had also come for treatment, they laughed and said she had failed again. The others were surprised because she had failed last time too. One of the warriors said that the trainees are treated at this place for free. However, it would be better to go elsewhere. He is sure that the dissatisfaction will only grow with time. But then suddenly the man whose arm Philomela had healed immediately stood up and told them to stop spreading these horrible rumors already. The girl didn't expect them to treat her like that, when suddenly she heard the warriors' shrieks of joy. They looked at some beautiful lady with pink hair and said that the wound was instantly healed. The girl was happy with her work, and other people were shocked because it happened as if by magic. The man she cured was very grateful to her for it. Then the stranger smiled happily at him and said that she was very glad that she could help brave knights like them during their training. Philomela knew the girl, of course. She was Prince Patricia's sister, and unlike herself, her girl was not useless. She was excellent. In fact, 16 years ago, a palace fortune teller predicted the birth of a saint. And then immediately afterwards she was born, the only legitimate daughter in the Phalanti family, Philomela. She was then immediately betrothed to Mr. Andrew. A few years later, an eloping and missing daughter died with her husband. So the palace learned that about the same time as Philomela, another girl was born, and it was Patricia. She was perceived as a Philon girl, so she was trained with Philomela. However, the girl at this moment kept thinking that she was the saint. But she didn't understand why everyone in the castle called Patricia so subtly, and she was only a false saint. Every time Philomela returned home after her practice, she would hear the maids talking in her manner. And so it was on this day. One of the maids said that Mrs. Patricia was completely different and that she was the one who should become a saint. Philomela walked by with her head down. She had certainly heard all the horrible talk and gossip that the maids were saying. However, they didn't care at all. The girls didn't understand why they had to serve this impostor when there was a real one. As the girl passed the window on her way to her room, she suddenly heard some noise downstairs. She immediately looked up to see what was going on. Down below, under the windows, of course, stood Patricia, and she was flanked by girls who admired her. The girl felt very bad about her, because unlike Philomela, everyone loves her and thinks she is a saint. Everyone thinks that she is the one who should be. But anyway, the girl only wants to become a saint in order to marry Mr. Andrew. Philomela continued to watch what was happening, when suddenly she saw something unusual. It was Mr. Andrew who approached Patricia. She watches them waving happily at each other. Afterward, Patricia ran up and hugged him, bouncing happily as she did so. Philomela, seeing this, was shocked. She could not believe that this was really happening. The girl thought that it just couldn't be. She didn't understand why it was that they were suddenly together. However, after that, the girl realized that she still had a lot of work to do, so she went to her office and started studying various papers. Suddenly, after a while, she felt someone's touch on her shoulder. When she turned around, She immediately saw the prince of the kingdom of Hilatos, Andrew, in front of her. He smiled and said hello to the girl. Looking her straight in the eye, the man said that he knew she was doing her best. But she needed to rest too, so he suggested that they have tea together. At that moment, Philomela thought that she might have been wrong, so she gladly agreed to have tea with Andrew. Soon they went to the gazebo, where the maid had already set the table. Andrew turned to the girl and said he had brought tea from her favorite eastern country. Philomela, hearing this, was immediately pleased. She giggled happily and thanked him for it. Andrew laughed and said he was just trying to please her for trying. Andrew laughed and said he was just trying to please her for her efforts. The man began to refill her cup with more tea and told her she didn't have to worry about that. Philomela blushed with embarrassment and joy and thanked him for it, taking the tea. The girl was very pleased at the thought that he had made the tea especially for her, so she eagerly began to taste it. But then something happened that she certainly didn't expect. Philomela suddenly felt very sick. She fell out of her chair and began to cough violently, trying to spit out all the tea she had taken. Andrew immediately ran over to her and began to take her in his arms while shouting for her to hold on. He was very scared for her. Philomela was half alive. She felt intense pain and realized that this was the end of it. She couldn't even make out what the boy was shouting. The girl felt very sad that Mr. Andrew had been so concerned about her, and she had let him down like this. But then suddenly she saw a wicked smile on his face, as if he was satisfied with what he had done. Philomela was very surprised when she saw this. However, the guy immediately continued to pretend to be very worried, and she still couldn't realize that it had really happened. The girl thought that it was just something she had imagined. She realized, however, that she could not have imagined it, and that he was really glad that she was dying. Philomela could not believe that it was Mr. Andrew, whom she trusted so much, who had poisoned her. At this, the girl who was reading the story suddenly closed the book because she saw a friend coming toward her. The girl was actually studying the content very carefully and was excited about everything that was going on. Her friend said hello and asked her why she was frowning again. I wondered if she was reading the book again. The girl shut it down and cheerfully said that's right. She actually hates this main antagonist of falsehood more than anything else in the world. Her friend asked if she meant the main character. However, the girl said that she was not, and the main character's name was Patricia, and the saint was Philomela. But then suddenly something strange happened. A bright light appeared around the girl, and then she suddenly opened her eyes. She had a bad headache, and the girl was no longer the same. She looked around, not knowing what was going on, because she wanted to discuss the affair with her friend. The girl could not understand where she was, because the interior was completely unfamiliar to her. She was lying on a luxurious bed, which she had never seen before. Suddenly the girl felt a sharp pain in her stomach and remembered that she had been poisoned. She looked at her hand, which was fine, and it surprised her. After that, the girl reached for the small sidebar that held a mirror to check if her face was okay. But as soon as she looked at herself in the mirror, she was shocked, and the girl started screaming loudly, not realizing who she even was and why she didn't look like before. The girl, having calmed down a little, began to examine herself carefully. She had beautiful blonde hair, and her eyes were green, like emeralds. The girl began to go over the various descriptions of the characters, but all she had in her mind was the image of Philomela. And that face looked incredibly like her. Then the girl finally decided that it was definitely her, the villain of the novel she loved so much. And when this information reached her, she suddenly started screaming again, not understanding. Had she really turned into a heroine of a parallel world? Philomela Falante, she died of poisoning. However, the girl could also quietly remember her past life, the one she lived in the ordinary human world. She had a complete family. However, her parents died early, leaving only her older sister. After graduating from university, she looked for a job. However, she fell into a bad company. There were just awful demands and crippling labor that loomed larger and larger every day. Sexual harassment and stalking constantly forced the girl to work overtime. One day she was even hospitalized because she lost consciousness due to overwork. and being unemployed, she was very much hooked by a healing novel she found by chance. However, now the girl thinks it's like getting into that company, only now in the guise of a saint. She realized that this place would not only teach her nothing, but would also ruin her psyche. It was the sad truth that the girl could not understand while she was reading the novel, sitting in a warm bed. Holy and Blessed Love is a love novel in which Patricia is the protagonist. Philomela Falante is already the saint, aka the villain. And Andrew and Patricia fight against her for her place as saint, for she can only be one. Despite Philomela's efforts, Patricia was still able to become a full-fledged saint and marry Prince Andrew. She also overcame the calamity and gave peace and tranquility to all the inhabitants. After that, they all lived happily ever after. At this point, the girl realized that in general, if you think about it that way, Philomela doesn't appear in the middle of the novel. So she urgently needed to remember what had happened there that was so serious that she hadn't been mentioned in a single sentence for the rest of the book. And then she remembered that when Patricia had become a saint, Philomela had been found guilty of everything, so a beheading awaited her. She shook the thought away, thinking that it couldn't be true. Andrew had poisoned her, and he hated that horrible Philomela so much. At that moment, the maids suddenly came into her room without even knocking on the door. One of them came into the room, and seeing that the lady was awake, said that she was finally awake. The other maid just started collecting various dresses with a disgruntled face, not even paying any attention to her. Philomela, at this moment, watching her, was very surprised that this maid didn't even knock. It was too cavalier of her, really. Then she suddenly remembered her lover and asked if Mr. Andrew was all right. The maid who was packing smiled and said that the center and Patricia were having fun together. And another said that Philomela was very poor, for no one had even come to visit her while she felt terrible. After that, the maids left, and Philomela was left alone. In fact, she was quite sure that it was Andrew who had tried to poison her. Then she got out of bed and started walking toward the bathroom, pulling herself up as she did so. She was glad that she was feeling a little better. She remembered that when she had opened her eyes, she had seen Andrew immediately in front of her. He had said he was worried about her and was glad she was awake, because his pleas had been answered. Philomela thought happily that though she had loved him once in the past, that was all behind her now. She couldn't understand why he would kill her in the first place. However, in any case, she decided that the heroine from that moment on would change, to certainly not allow such an ending. The girl was very serious. She paced around the room and thought about the fact that if she did die, she didn't know what she would do in that case. But at that moment, the door to the room suddenly opened abruptly, and again, no one knocked. The girl's back even hurt because the door was opened quite abruptly. She immediately said loudly that she was hurt, and then saw some black-haired guy in front of her who apologized and asked if she had accidentally bruised herself. Philomela was shocked at this. She immediately moved away from the man because she felt uncomfortable and began to quickly say that she was fine and that she was apologizing to him. In fact, this awkward situation occurred because the girl tried to go out, and he, on the contrary, to enter the corridor. But the guy suddenly did not wait long, got up from the floor and, apologizing, started to leave. The girl, left alone, could not understand who it was and why he aroused such strange emotions in her. The stranger continued down the corridor when suddenly some black stain appeared before his glove, followed by smoke. Philomela was shocked for a while and continued to sit in one place. She heard someone talking in the room nearby and moved closer to hear what they were saying. Then she heard the rough voice of a man yelling, saying that this was going nowhere, and if they accepted the terms of the engagement, they would stay on the plus side. The other man asked in surprise if he really thought it was selfish self-aggrandizement and would agree to such a thing. The girl, sitting up in surprise, did not understand who they were talking about. Then the man asked if he meant Philomela, and at that moment she realized that the two men were talking about her. But suddenly she heard footsteps behind her and was immediately startled. When she looked back, she saw a familiar face. She smiled awkwardly and blushed even with excitement. It was Andrew, of course. He smiled and asked what she was doing here, if she was feeling better. The girl realized that she looked stupid and, turning away from him, replied that she had just decided to take a little walk and had even run into an unknown guy along the way. Andrew suddenly became much more serious and replied in a rough voice that there were quite a few people from other countries who had arrived at the estate and wanted to use the saint's power. But afterward he smiled affectionately again and replied that he was very glad she was better, for he had worried about her quite a lot. Philomela stammered and laughed nervously, apologizing for the inconvenience. She said she would try to make sure it never happened again, and winked at him as she said those words. Then suddenly Andrew blurted out and replied that it was just awful. He was insanely sorry that he hadn't been able to help her then. The thought that she might not wake up caused him incredible pain. Philomela was watching at this point. She thought his acting skills were certainly top-notch, and if she hadn't seen his smile then, she would surely be hooked again now. The girl thought about the fact that he was an incredibly rotten man, and with such certainly does not have the best dealings. But Andrew at that moment replied that he would definitely find the culprit in her terrible poisoning. But because of the lack of evidence, the case is not moving forward at all. Philomela smiled and said that was sad enough, and thought to herself that all he had to do to find the culprit was to look in the mirror and he would see him at once. But at that moment, Andrew suddenly fixed her hair behind her ears and, coming closer, told her that he was going to the country they suspected of supplying the poison, and also asked the girl to apologize for not being able to stay by her side in such a difficult moment. These words made the girl even angrier, but she tried to keep her emotions in check so as not to give herself away. Andrew kept talking and replied that she could already hear from the maid that she had fainted from overwork. The thing is that they don't want to publicize the incident, so not many people know about it. Because of this, he also apologizes to her a lot. Philomela was very surprised to hear this. She had never even heard of it before. The girl said goodbye to him, waving goodbye, and thought that, in principle, it would be a good opportunity to pin the crime on an innocent man to complete the case she had started. She was very glad that he would not be in the castle for a while, for this would be her chance, a very good chance. She was going to escape from this horrible place. After that, the girl went straight to her father's study. When she entered, she bowed and asked him if he had summoned her. She was in the office of the head of the Filante family. There was a man sitting behind a huge desk, looking very serious. In fact, the relationship between his father and Philomela was never good. He only cared about Patricia. After all, she was good at everything, unlike his own daughter. Because of his own daughter's failure, his love for her was completely gone. He didn't believe that Philomela was capable of anything. He was accustomed to seeing the result of labors that put in all their strength. When the girl came to his office, she could not understand what he wanted. But she could not show her excitement to him, because then she would arouse suspicion. When the man suddenly spoke up and said she wasn't good enough and she was always giving him a lot of problems that he had to solve, Philomela did not know what he was talking about and asked him what he meant. The man replied that he had already asked her not to mislead Patricia. The girl was very surprised at what her father was saying. She couldn't believe that he was going to scold her for her actions and try to teach her about life. Then the man suddenly went on talking in a serious voice. He said that he hadn't really realized that he didn't love her before, but not so much that he'd completely forgotten, so he'd recently received an engagement proposal. Philomela, on hearing this, was very much surprised. But her father asked that she should be grateful, for it was the cursed country that was offering her marriage, and they should accept her in return for the power of a saint. The girl at this moment thought that, in fact, she would be very happy to find a good man with whom she could associate her life. In fact, the cursed country, namely the Elkir kingdom, is next door to the Hilatos kingdom, and when the calamity came, it fell first. However, Patricia dealt with it with the help of her magic power. It is safe to say that the cursed country was shown as if it were the source of the disaster. The girl at that moment suddenly wondered if the story would unfold in exactly the same way. In fact, it was hard for her to imagine what people were thinking in that country. Philomela is actually interfering with Andrew and Patricia's wedding. Her notoriety prevents her from marrying someone from a friendly country. So apparently they concluded that the best option would be to just send her to a cursed country where they would forget everything and cut her out of their lives. Philomela realized that it was very strange, and it frightened her, because everything is turning out quite differently than it should in the book. When the girl is sent to another country, she continues to insist on her engagement to Andrew, although he refuses. However, the present Philomela responded quite differently. She told her father that she agreed to what he was proposing. The man, hearing her reply, exhaled heavily and said that, as expected, she was only thinking of herself. But then he suddenly analyzed her answer and questioned what it was she was saying. He couldn't believe that she had actually agreed. So Philomela replied that she would marry a man from the cursed country after the poisoning. Her eyes opened and she apologized to her father for being so foolish and naive before. The girl put her hands on her chest and said that actually during this time she had realized that the real saint was Patricia. So her and Andrew's engagement should never take place. She smiled with tears in her eyes and said that if they would accept her as she was, the girl would be very happy to marry a man from a cursed country. And she herself thought at that moment that surely nothing catastrophic would happen if she just changed the plot a little. After all, whoever was there would be much better than staying in this place. She began to wipe away her tears and said that she would like to leave the country before Prince Andrew returned from his trip, for it would be very painful for her to meet him again. The father was astonished at his daughter's decision. However, he said that if she really did it, he would agree, and they would do so. However, she must remember that she will not be able to change her decision. Philomela, smiling, replied that she understood, but she was actually overjoyed that she would be able to get as far away from this place as possible. After meeting with her father, she went to her room, and as soon as she stepped inside and closed the door, she exhaled with relief. She was actually very tired, and she hoped she had done the right thing in making that choice. Suddenly, she was immediately met by Patricia. She looked at the girl in surprise and asked, "Has your sister come already?" Philomela did not expect to see her. However, she shouted her name happily. But the girl thought that, as expected, the protagonist would be very nice, and so it turned out. Patricia suddenly said that she had heard their conversation with her father and asked in surprise, "Is she really going to marry someone from a cursed country?" Philomela laughed nervously and said that it made her a little sad to talk about it. She didn't have time to finish her sentence, however, because the girl interrupted her at once. Patricia suddenly became very rude and said she was very pathetic and let this damned country, but she was still ashamed that she were related at all. Then the girl smiled happily and told her sister not to worry about it, because there was nothing to be done. No one loved her, so she had to choose from what she was given. Philomela was furious. She had not expected Patricia to have such a temper, but she thought she could bear it, and the hour of reckoning would come soon enough. In fact, because of the jumbled memories, the girl had completely forgotten just how awful Patricia had been. And it used to be her all-time favorite novel, and she was incredibly fond of the heroine. However, now that she's dealing with her so closely, she doesn't like her at all anymore. But Philomela smiled and answered the girl that she would try not to inconvenience the inhabitants of the cursed country. Patricia, hearing this, was very surprised. She didn't understand why the girl suddenly reacted like that. She had always resisted and insisted on her own way. Then the girl, in order to completely piss Patricia off, also thanked her for her concern in the matter. Patricia couldn't hold back her emotions any longer lest she snap. She started to walk away and caught the girl's shoulder, pushing her in the process. Before she left, she also told her sister that she was kind of boring and just went about her business. Philomela became very angry. She didn't understand what kind of child she was and why she had to behave like this. In fact, in her past life, the girl constantly worked for the good of the company and did not even think of anything bad until she was in the hospital. She realized that there was no way she could make the same mistake again, and she just needed to try harder, not run away right away. Some time had passed since that day, and Philomela was sitting in her room drinking tea when suddenly a maid came in and threw her suitcase on the floor, saying that the carriage from the cursed country had already arrived, so she must hurry. She looked disdainfully at the mistress and replied that she was leaving the rest to her. The maid was not going to do anything in Philomella's place. The girl at this point watched the whole thing, and the maid said that she wasn't going to serve this impostor anymore, and that was the end of it. She was about to leave when Philomela called out to her. Dahlia, who was a maid, was very surprised, for her mistress had never done such a thing before. As it was, the girl smiled and thanked her for everything. She said that the maid always took care of her, so Philomela asked her to give her a good job as a thank you for everything. The girl also congratulated her and said that she would go to the front of the battlefield. Dahlia, hearing this, was very surprised. She looked at the lady and asked what she was talking about. Philomela calmly continued to drink her tea and said that if she wasn't mistaken, she was also a candidate for Patricia's maid. However, it wasn't like she didn't like her job. However, nevertheless, the girl has done a very good job, so the mistress is absolutely sure that in the new place, she will not be as bad as it may seem at first glance. Many people may find it strange, because they do not understand what a servant who does not have magical abilities can do on the battlefield. Most often it is actually cleaning the place after the exercise with monsters. It is literally a hellish job, hated by all the servants. Philomela told her father that of course she had no right to decide where to send a person because of her reputation. However, Dahlia has been working very hard, so she asks that he give her a good job. Philomela realized that there was no way Patricia would choose her maid, and the result still exceeded her expectations. The maid, hearing all this, could not even stand on her feet. She was so shocked that she fell to the floor and just stared blankly away. Philomela smiled and looked at the maid, saying that she didn't know where she would end up. However, the work there would obviously be much harder than in this place. Therefore, the girl wished her good luck. She also said to make sure the maid did a good job there to establish herself to the best of her ability. After that, Philomela started to leave, for her carriage was already waiting for her. She took her suitcase and said goodbye to the maid Dahlia. She still didn't understand what was going on. She didn't want to go to the battlefield. When the girl stepped out into the hallway, she was overjoyed. She stretched and thought that now she had one less problem to worry about. At this very time, there was a secret meeting going on in the LCR kingdom. The man with red hair said that on second thought, some people said that already the saint was coming to them. His partner replied that it was all Julian's decision. However, he did not understand how it was possible to be engaged to a woman of such terrible fame. The guy said that if she was that bad, he would personally do something about it. His partner replied that he'd rather not say anything because he wanted to live longer. However, the man who was the most in charge among them said they could be sure he wasn't going to use his brother and wouldn't let her do whatever she wanted. At that very time, Philomela had already gone outside and saw many carriages pulling up to her estate. She was very surprised, and one of the knights said that they had come especially for her. The girl could not believe that this was really true. The girl could not believe that it was true after all. So many knights had come to escort her to the manor. Philomela was very curious about what lay ahead of her. Then she began to look at the carriages, which were incredibly beautifully made. But then suddenly the knight who stood in front turned to the girl and said that he had come to take her to the kingdom of Elkir. Philomela was suddenly very surprised. She began to stare at everything that was happening, and many terrible thoughts came into her head. The girl has already begun to even worry, because at this point it is very important for her to show herself on the good side, in order to establish and refute all those rumors about her. Then Philomela bowed, curtsied, and thanked them for coming all this way. She was very grateful to them, and glad that they were accompanying her. The knights, who were just packing all her things into the carriage, were very surprised. They didn't expect the girl to say such a thing, for they had also heard about her. It had been quite some time, and the sun had already begun to go below the horizon. Then they finally arrived in the cursed land, namely, the kingdom of Elkir. In fact, because of the name, the girl kept thinking that the atmosphere in this place would be much more gloomy. However, Watching the people through the window, she saw that everyone was alive and living quite well. Then suddenly she noticed a ladybug on the window of the carriage, which flew to her and tried to get in. Philomela took it on her finger, and she was suddenly very curious as to what curse lay on this side, for the naked eye could not tell that anything was wrong. The girl drove on, and the ladybug flew away from her. In fact, she thought it would be a good idea if Patricia broke the spell. Soon, the carriage stopped near the manor house, and Philomela at once began to get out. The girl was met at the entrance by several knights as well as a butler. He bowed as he greeted the lady and thanked her for coming to the kingdom of Elkir. Philomela smiled in greeting. She was pleased to be greeted in such a way. She looked around and noticed that the man she had seen in the castle a short time ago had not arrived. Well, then she had an open question as to who it was after all. She thought he was a knight, though he was dressed differently, but perhaps he belonged to a higher society. The girl decided not to torture herself with questions and doubts. She realized that soon she would know everything anyway. After all, they would be in the same castle. The butler and the knights immediately began to accompany Philomela. They did not go to the entrance of the castle, but somewhere else. The girl wondered where they were taking her. She assumed that perhaps they had just decided to give her a little tour. However, they soon came to a small house that stood in the middle of the forest. The butler stopped and said that this palace had been prepared especially for her. The girl was shocked to hear this. In fact, she of course understood that she would not be settled in the manor. However, as she looked at the palace in detail, she felt a strange atmosphere. She noticed that it had been cared for. However, the building is still very old. Therefore, it is even collapsing at some points. Philomela realized that she would be very lonely alone in this place. Then she turned to the butler and asked when she would meet the royal family. However, the butler replied that the king was very busy at the moment, so she would have to wait a little longer. The girl was very upset when she heard this, because she had originally thought that she would be greeted. She even got the impression that she wasn't expected to be there at all. This was a feeling she had constantly had towards the bow, and even the fact that no one had come to greet her except the palace workers was strange enough in her opinion. And they treated her politely, of course, and it was much better than at home. The girl thought that she didn't really want anything special, so she decided that she would just move on, not paying attention to such trifles. Then Philomela smiled at the workers and said that she understood everything, and thanked them from the bottom of her heart for helping her. She has a new life ahead of her. Now she will spend her time at her own pleasure, without wasting a single second. Soon it was already evening, and the young lad who lived there returned to the royal palace. The servants immediately greeted him and helped him remove his outer garments. They bowed and said to him, "Welcome back." It was Prince Gillian. The man immediately looked at them and asked that they send a knight to meet the daughter of the Marquis of Filante of Hileto. The maid bowed and said she understood and would now invite him to the prince. Gillian himself, when left alone, realized that danger lay ahead. He never thought he'd have to take the Marquise's daughter in return for carrying Saint. After a while, there was a knock at the prince's room. He immediately allowed entry. It was the prince who had just met the girl. He asked if Gillian had summoned him. The prince, without turning around, asked how things had gone with the Marquis Filon's daughter, if they had any problems or misunderstandings. The knight was very worried about the meeting with the master. However, he replied that it didn't go so smoothly after all, and several situations arose. Gillian was very surprised, but did not question him further. He asked how they had gotten to the country in general. The knight immediately began to tell everything in detail, and after a while he even relaxed and felt comfortable. The guy said in conclusion that the girl was very different from the stories and various rumors of people. She was even very polite to them. The prince looked at him suspiciously and asked what he thought it even meant. The guy said that in fact, when they first arrived, they thought that the girl would initially be rude to them, since neither personal knights nor servants were able to accompany her. However, the miss behaved the opposite, smiling and not complaining at all. Gillian was very surprised and asked if it was really true. The knight confirmed it and said that there had not been a single complaint on her part the whole way. Even though the hotel wasn't very comfortable, however, she seemed quite happy with everything. She even really liked the food they ate there. Knight had even heard that there were many negative rumors about her. However, she turned out to be much kinder and friendlier than he thought. The prince, having heard all this information, replied that he now understood everything, and after that he thanked him for his work, and also told him that he could sit down. In fact, he thought that Mrs. Philomena would be furious. However, he couldn't understand why she was so excited about going to this place. In fact, everyone in their country knows the notoriety of Mistress Philomena Philante of the Hilaitos Kingdom. She is rumored to be a lazy and arrogant girl who likes to brag about her position. All the residents call her a false saint to her face because of the obvious power differential with the other saint applicant. Jillian tried his best not to take the terms too far, but after thinking it over, he agreed to accept her as his bride. He didn't want to believe the rumors, but there was no smoke without fire, and perhaps there was some truth in them. The prince decided that he should definitely see for himself and not believe anyone until then, nor should he jump to conclusions. Soon the night was upon us, a deep night. The boy blew out his candle, the only one burning in his room, and after that, a bright purple light suddenly started coming from the windows of his office, and soon it all stopped. Then the little cat started to open someone's black paw. After that, a black cat jumped out of the window. In fact, it was actually just Jillian. He thought that if you plan to find out something, it's better to do it yourself. It's more reliable that way. Almost all night the cat sat under the girl's manor, and soon it was morning. He continued to sit and watch, waiting for her to wake up. In fact, this palace was prepared just for her, even though it is small. However, there is no better place for a vacation. Jillian climbed up on the roof of the house and opened the window. Soon he was inside the house, thinking that this place would not be a place for a lover of wealth and luxury as the girl was. Soon the cat began to pass by the mistress's maids. They were talking, and he could catch a few phrases. One of the girls said it was very strange. You could see from the other maid's face that she agreed. They couldn't believe that the girl really always acted like this. Jillian noticed this as he passed by. He scrutinized the maids and remembered that she was the one in charge of the palace. Hearing them talk, the boy thought that perhaps Philomela was being arrogant when she was alone. The prince suggested that it was more likely that the knight had simply made a mistake, or that she was playing her part in public. Jillian, walking further and further through the manor, thought that if the girl's temper was still as the rumors said, he would definitely need to be more careful being around her. Soon the cat walked through the entire estate and went to the backyard, where it was just as beautiful. However, as soon as he saw the girl, he immediately stopped. He was very surprised, not realizing what was happening. Philomela lay on the grass surrounded by various animals. They sniffed at her in surprise and even petted her. The girl looked incredibly happy. She took the vixen in her arms and said that she was so cute and friendly. She really liked playing with these animals. Jillian was serious. He watched it all from the side and realized that he had no turning back, for the animals of this forest had always been very wild. They didn't attack humans, of course, but they had never gotten close to them either. So to see them now playing affectionately with the girl was a great surprise to him. Suddenly a maid ran up to the girl and told her that she could soil her clothes by sitting like this on the grass. But Philomela didn't care. She kept hugging the little fox and said that it could be washed. So the maid wouldn't have to worry, she would take care of it herself. The prince was very surprised when he heard this. He couldn't believe that the girl had actually said that she would wash her own clothes. Then the maid brought a small brush and asked that the mistress let them take care of it. She wanted to tidy up the girl's hair, but Philomela did not agree. She took the rabbit in her arms and, glancing at the maid, asked if she had not already done enough. The cat, who was watching all of this from behind a tree, didn't understand what was going on, because this girl didn't look at all like what the rumors described. The maid went to do her duty, and Philomela was left alone. She turned to the chick, who was perched on her finger, and said that they were engaged after all. Then, disappointed, she asked if it wasn't awful that he didn't even want to meet her in person. When Jillian heard that, he immediately realized that it was about him. He even felt a little ashamed. But then, suddenly the little deer began to rub against the girl's face. She laughed happily and asked if it was his way of comforting her. But the girl was still grateful to him. For a while, Jillian just watched it all. The girl continued to pet the animals and have fun with them. However, then suddenly the prince who was in the body of a cat felt very strange. His eyes became heavier and were closing. He realized that his strength was already leaving him. As much as he wanted to fall right there, he had no way to resist it. Fatigue took over, and the cat just collapsed under the tree unconscious. At this time, the other animals who were waiting their turn for the girl to rinse them suddenly became very surprised. They looked in the direction of the prince, who was lying under a tree. Philomela turned her attention to it. She suddenly asked what was going on. Then she followed them to see what they were so interested in. Soon the girl came to the tree and suddenly saw a black cat lying on the ground. She was very frightened and asked if he had hurt himself somewhere. By then, the prince had regained some strength and could walk. He regained consciousness and realized that things were very bad now that she had noticed him. And just as he was about to leave, the girl suddenly took him in her arms and pulled him to her. Philomela began to hug him gently and told him it was okay. He didn't have to be afraid of her. She wouldn't do him any harm. Jillian suddenly began to purr, as cats usually do, and he felt much better. The pain began to go away, which surprised him because it had never happened before. The girl continued stroking him, and after scrutinizing him from his side, she said that it didn't look like he was hurt, and his body was so cold. But she decided not to pay much attention to it. Philomela continued to hold him in her arms and set off in the direction of the house to take care of him properly. As soon as the girl brought him to her little estate, she immediately prepared a bath for him with very warm water to warm him up and wash him properly. As she nursed Jillian back to health, he was enjoying the process. In fact, he hadn't felt this relaxed in a very long time. He felt warm and very good. Due to the fact that the cat was enjoying such procedures, he didn't even notice how he found himself in the house. Soon he realized this and started to lash out to escape as soon as possible. The girl's grip was quite strong. She continued to hold him, but Jillian didn't want to see all this because she had also already taken a bath and was in her robe. The cat closed his eyes and tried to run away, but the girl grabbed him in time, saying that everything was fine. After all, they were almost done, and soon he would feel very good. At this point, she put him back in the tub and began gently massaging the top of his head. Jillian didn't understand what it was that felt so good, but he didn't want it to stop. After that, Philomela began to give his belly button and the rest of his body a good scrubbing. It felt really good, and he didn't want it all to stop because of those feelings. He didn't understand what was going on, and thought that maybe it was just some kind of magic, and he wasn't even in pain from what she was doing. The girl took the kitten to her room, and he curled up and fell asleep on her bed. The girl took the kitten to her room, and it curled up and fell asleep on her bed. Philomela looked at him joyfully and thought that now everything was okay, and he would be much better than he was, and she lay down beside him and scrutinized the animal. It had a very beautiful fur. The girl talked to the cat, although she realized that most likely he could not hear her. She said that his body was very cold, and she did not even know what to do. Philomela was glad that taking a hot bath turned out to be the right decision. She was very lucky this time. After that, the girl closed her eyes and fell asleep lying next to the kitten. Soon it was morning, and she started to wake up. Philomela began to open her eyes, not understanding why it was so warm next to her. Well, when she opened her eyes and saw that next to her lay not a black kitten, but a guy, she was very surprised. Jillian hugged the girl in her sleep, and she began to scream, not understanding what it all meant and how it could have happened, because she had fallen asleep all alone. She couldn't understand how it was that when she opened her eyes, she saw a handsome man beside her. She began to scrutinize his appearance. She suddenly realized that she had seen him somewhere before, but she couldn't remember where. Jillian was awake at that moment too, and they looked at each other in surprise. For a while they just lay there and looked into each other's eyes. Everyone was very uncomfortable with the situation, and the girl still couldn't understand what it all meant. Then, Philomela, seeing his beautiful eyes, realized that she had seen him then in the manor. But she did not understand why the false king was suddenly lying beside her, for she had fallen asleep with the kitten. Remembering the small and defenseless creature, she immediately got out of bed and began nervously searching the room for the poor kitten. But at that moment, she suddenly looked at the guy who continued to lie on the bed. He suddenly covered his mouth with his hand and blushed very red. Jillian apologized to her. Philomela didn't understand what he was talking about, what he was apologizing for. She couldn't understand much at all right now, but at that moment, Julian suddenly noticed that he had lifted his sleeve a little, and a black spot was visible from there. He was very scared that the girl might see it, so he immediately took his hand away from his mouth and started to cover the spot where the black spot was with his sleeve. They were silent for a while, then Philomela decided to diffuse the situation, and smiling, asked what the knight was doing in her bed. The man, hearing this, immediately looked at her and asked who she was talking about. Hearing that, she was very surprised. I guess he is not a knight after all. But then there is another question. Who is he really? The guy got out of bed abruptly and said that he was late after all, and then he introduced himself. He said he was the second prince, Gillian Elker. The girl, hearing this, was even more surprised. She could not believe that he was the second prince, for then he was her fiancé. She asked that he take his time and tell her everything as it was. Gillian sat down on the bed and explained the situation to her. The girl summarized that he was the cat after all. In fact, she had once heard a long time ago that the people of the cursed country were very good at using magic, and each member of the royal family had a unique ability. And speaking of His Highness Gillian, he has the magic of reincarnation. The girl had experienced it firsthand. Philomela began to scrutinize his face. In fact, it was so delightful and amazing that she could barely contain her emotions. But she didn't understand why the guy was reincarnating specifically as a cat, and assumed that he had probably come to the castle like this before. The girl began to remember all the events of the previous evening and remembered how she had gently bathed the kitten in the bathtub. She felt ashamed about it. The guy also remembered all of this. Then he lowered his head and said that he was really changing a lot in front of her. He didn't want to put her in such an awkward position. Philomela, who was still in shock, stammered and replied that it was actually all right. It's all in the past. Gillian looked at her carefully then and said that he was pretty sure she already knew that it was a country many people called cursed. He explained that, in fact, the members of the royal family were indeed very good at magic. However, the curse could have serious consequences. Then she started remembering the kitten she had nursed last night and said it made her dizzy and her body very cold. Gillian was surprised that she had guessed so quickly. However, he nodded in agreement. Philomela then had a sudden thought. She thought that surely that black spot on his wrist must have something to do with the curse. But the girl decided that she'd better not question it for now, since he'd gotten it out of her sight so quickly. Julian was silently just looking at the girl at this time. He realized that she had a lot of different questions and thoughts in her head, but he thought about the fact that even though the circumstances were different, when he touched her, his pain had subsided. And for the first time in a very long time, he was able to fall asleep and slept through the night completely undisturbed. At that moment, Gillian suddenly got out of bed and went to the window. The strong wind caused the curtain to rise, and he said he would be back soon. When the wind died down, a black cat was sitting on the window, looking at the girl. Philomela was surprised, for she had hoped to the last that he was not the cat. Her hopes, however, proved wrong. The boy stopped for a while. He apologized for greeting her at once, but said that he would definitely come to the palace again, but in human form. Philomela said goodbye to him, and afterward, smiling, she thought that she had thought before that she could hate him after such an act. However, he had turned out to be quite good at first sight. At that moment, two maids suddenly rushed into her room. One was carrying a cart, and the other a mop. They apologized for the intrusion. However, one of the maids said that she would now help eat the dress and asked that the mistress let her help put it on and do her makeup too. At this moment, Gillian, in the form of a cat, began to descend the roof, and he was soon on the ground. The light voices of the maids and Philomela could be heard. At that moment, he thought about how the girl was very different from the rumors he had heard all this time. The boy didn't know what to do, but he decided that he should at least talk to her, and normally in human form to begin with. With these thoughts, Gillian went to his manor. When he reached the castle, he immediately transformed into a human form. He was about to go to his room, when suddenly a man with red hair and a black stain on his face came out to meet him. He immediately turned to Gillian and said hello, saying that it wasn't often that he could be seen first thing in the morning. Gillian immediately stopped. He hadn't expected to meet him or anyone else on the road. He stood there for a while, wondering what to say. The guy thought for a while, glimpsed him, and said in a serious voice that if he was coming back so early, it meant he had a lot of work to do. After that, he headed back to the manor. The man with the red hair didn't understand what was happening. Then he suddenly looked in the direction Julian had come from, and remembered that that was the direction of the lady's palace. The boy smiled evilly. He was very interested in this situation, and he was going to find out what was going on. At this time, Julian had already entered the manor and went about his business. He went into his room and changed his clothes to freshen up. Before leaving, the lad turned to the butler and said that he was going to formally greet Mrs. Philomela Falante. The butler, hearing this, was very surprised. He looked at the gentleman's to-do list and asked if he really wanted to go there. Julian replied that he didn't know her well yet, so he didn't want her to leave the castle alone. The houseworker was still very surprised. However, there was nothing left for him to do but agree. So he had to reschedule some of the master's business for another time. Julian, meanwhile, had already approached the girl's manor and was standing at the entrance, thinking about various things. He realized that he really needed to get to know the girl better in order to know how to behave. At that moment, the maid of the house, who was sweeping the entrance, passed him. He thought it would be best to ask the maid first, so the man approached her and asked if Mrs. Philomela was at home. The maid, who had been going about her business all this time, did not notice who was addressing her. However, when she turned her head, she saw the second crown prince. The girl was very frightened, and after that she ran somewhere to the side to call out to the lady. She asked him to wait a little longer. Julian didn't understand why the maid was suddenly so surprised. He thought that maybe something had happened, and that was why she was so startled. But at that moment, he suddenly heard someone shouting behind the house. It was the voice of the maid who was saying that she had guests coming, and the girl, when she heard that the prince had already come, was really surprised. Julian decided to go and see what was going on. When he got to the backyard, he saw Philomela, all dressed up, standing by the barbecue grill, hurriedly eating a kebab. Because she was in a hurry, she even got dirty and choked on it. But when she looked up and saw the prince, she smiled awkwardly at him. After that, she swallowed the piece of meat she had in her mouth and exhaled heavily and turned to Prince Julian, asking if he wanted to join them casually. The guy didn't mind, and soon the maids prepared a small table on which they laid out the kebab, recently cooked. And the two of them were very awkward, so for a while they just sat and looked at each other without even saying a word. However, after that, the girl pointed to a stick with a kebab, which was lying in front of the prince, and wished him a pleasant appetite. Juliana didn't answer anything. He glanced at the huge portion of kebab and didn't even try it. They had the girl's awkward silence again. She didn't like it at all, so she decided to strike up a conversation. Philomela was nervous, especially remembering the events of the previous night. She asked him if he was here for a specific reason, or if he was just visiting. Suddenly the maid stood up in defense. When the man did not answer, one of them came closer to him and said that Madame's meat was very tasty and he should try it. The other maid also said that she actually really didn't think he had ever tried anything like that. Julian continued to sit in silence. In fact, watching all this, he would never have thought it would turn out this way. He remembered that the girl had been playing with animals just the previous day, and she had already cooked him a kebab. He thought she was really full of surprises. Philomela looked him straight in the eye and, smiling, promised him that there really wasn't any poison in this food. Julian was incredulous and began to eat anyway. He said as he sliced into his meat that he hadn't warned her about his visit, so he didn't think she would have had time to prepare for something like this. After that, he started to taste the dish the girl had prepared and thought that even if it was there, it still didn't affect him because of a rare feature. But at this moment, when he had already tasted the taste of this meat, he was very surprised. He looked at the girl and asked in a rough voice what kind of meat it was. Philomela, as well as the maids, were very surprised. However, afterward she said that the little demonic beast that the knight had caught had been given to her by the maid, so she decided to cook it and see what would come of it. However, Giuliano was very surprised to hear this. He thought that their meat was certainly edible. However, he had never tasted tastier than this in his life. He didn't even expect that the meat of demonic beasts could be so delicious. He looked at the girl and was about to ask if she had a chance to make it again. But when he saw her frightened face, he didn't do it. He suddenly stood up from the table and, looking at the girl carefully, apologized. However, he said that he had to return to the castle urgently. He also added that the food was very tasty, and he was grateful for it. Going home, he realized that not only does this girl like all animals, but also the meat of demonic beasts can cook very tasty. Of course, these are small things, but not the kind of things one would normally think about. Rummaging through all these thoughts in his head, he suddenly involuntarily began to smile. He soon returned to his estate, and as he went into his study, he suddenly wondered what special power Mrs. Philomela possessed. As soon as he entered the room, he suddenly saw a stranger there. The guy was very surprised. However, when that person turned to him, he immediately recognized him. Jillian looked at him in surprise and asked his brother, "Did something happen to him?" The guy with the red hair was Julian's brother. He turned and, flirting, asked, "Has he decided to visit Mrs. Philomela?" It was the first prince, named Clyde Elkier. He looked at his brother and asked what he could say about the girl. Jillian, still standing near the exit, replied that he couldn't yet say which rumors were true. He thought that the servants were just enamored of the girl anyway. He didn't tell his brother that, however. Clyde looked at him gravely and asked himself, is he wondering if these rumors are justified? Jillian replied that there were actually a few other things that were stressing him out, so he still couldn't say an exact verdict on her. Clyde watched him carefully. Afterward, he turned around and asked, maybe he should go to her too and check it out for himself. Jillian was very surprised, and when his brother saw his frightened face, he immediately asked what he was so surprised about. The prince replied that it's nothing like that, it's just too early to say anything, and he didn't want anything to happen to his brother. Clyde looked at his brother carefully and thought about various things. He didn't understand why he was having such an adamant reaction. It was as if he didn't want to let him anywhere near the girl. He went to the exit to think about what was going on. He told his brother before he left that if he had any problems, he would let him know, and apologized for burdening him like that. When he left, Julian exhaled with relief. He looked out the window and thought that this was all coming together so unexpectedly, not at all the way he'd wanted it to. He thought of his brother and decided that he had no reason to worry about him, for it was unlikely that Clyde would do anything bad. At this very time, Philomela had already entered her room. She thought about the fact that His Highness Jillian had promised to visit her often. It seemed like he should come the next day as well. And at that moment, the girl suddenly heard a knock on the door. She immediately started running out joyfully, shouting his name. But she was unpleasantly surprised when she ran outside and found that it wasn't Jillian standing in front of her. Clyde, who was standing in front of the girl, smiled and, making a surprised look, said that it didn't seem to be Jillian as she had expected. The girl didn't realize who it was standing in front of her. She had never seen him before. The girl looked at him in surprise for a while. After that, she realized that she had to show hospitality. She asked the maid to bring tea to the table in the courtyard, and they sat waiting for her to do so. When she did, Clyde looked at the girl and apologized. He didn't really mean to scare her. While Philomela drank her tea, he smiled and explained that he had actually wanted to check the condition of this palace for a long time now, which was why he had come. The girl smiled back at him and replied that there was actually nothing wrong with that, and asked what was surely a knight. Clyde smiled at that moment. He realized that the girl didn't recognize him, so he stood up and bowed, apologizing for not introducing himself. After that, he said his name and said that he was the head of the knights of this country. The girl, hearing this, applauded happily with her hands. She smiled and said that it was beautifully simple. Then she began to look closely at Clyde and realized that he was probably a great knight, and she was pretty sure that he certainly didn't lack strength. At this very time, Jillian finally came to the girl's palace as well. As soon as he approached, he saw that the door was open and he was greatly delayed. The prince, without even knocking, opened the door and was very surprised to see Philomela drinking tea with his brother. And the girl, on seeing him, immediately exclaimed, for she was very glad to see Julian. However, the boy was very serious. He looked at Clyde and asked his older brother what he was doing in this place. And Philomela, hearing those words, looked at Clyde in surprise. She didn't understand why Jillian had called him Big Brother, and then she guessed that he had deceived her by calling himself the head knight. Then the girl stood up and, bowing, asked for forgiveness. She said she was very sorry that she did not recognize him. Clyde stroked her head, however, and smiled and replied that there was nothing wrong with that. He'd lied to her too, telling her who he wasn't. Philomela was surprised at the gesture. She hadn't expected the eldest prince himself to stroke her head and apologize. Jillian, who had been watching them all this time, suddenly turned to his brother in tears and said that he must have deliberately decided to get ahead of him. Clyde didn't say anything to that. He just glanced at his brother and smiled. And he thought to himself at that moment that Julian must really like the cutie. He meant the girl, of course. Julian, watching everything that was happening, still couldn't understand why his brother was being so nice. It was so ignorant. But at that moment, Clyde suddenly got up from the table and said that, in fact, he was just wondering how the famous Mrs. Falanti was doing. But then, as he stretched with his arms and left the table, he said he saw that they were doing well here, and it made his heart go away. Well, then the girl suddenly looked at him and asked if he wasn't feeling well. Clyde, however, smiled and replied that he was actually fine. After that, she asked if she'd heard the rumors about their curse. He said that they were under the influence of this curse all the time, and the marks of it hurt all the time. And unfortunately, nothing could ease their difficult burden. But at that moment, Julian suddenly objected and interrupted his brother. He wanted him to stop talking. But the guy, smiling, replied that the girl should actually know about it. He thought about it, though, and decided that she didn't really care, so it was okay.